Chapter 5. The Lake. Back in Capernaum, the beach continued to be the favorite venue for Jesus' meetings, and Peter's boat was as often as not his platform. The open air always allowed sufficient space for the ever-expanding crowds. For visual aids, he needed no chalkboard, but used the natural things around him to illustrate his message. The lake, the farmland, and the hills behind Capernaum. The local population was divided between fishers and farmers. And just because Jesus liked to do his teaching from a boat didn't mean he was ignoring the farmers. Whenever you farmers sow your seed, inevitably some falls on the hard, packed soil of the public footpaths, where it's quickly pecked up by the birds. Other seeds land on rocky ground, no depths of soil there, so its growth spurt is short-lived. Some farmers neglect to pull the weeds before sowing. So though the seed germinates, there's no harvest because the new growth is choked off before it can even bear fruit. Happily, some seed falls into good, deep topsoil, where it produces a return of 30, 60, even 100 times your original investment. The kingdom of God is like the soil's natural ability to make seed grow. All you farmers have to do, once the seed is in the ground, is to sleep peacefully in your beds till harvest time. Much laughter, particularly from the fishers. Or you ladies would appreciate this. It's like tiny flakes of yeast that you sprinkle into the flour. Makes a world of difference how the dough rises. Or you fishers might understand this better if I said that the kingdom of heaven is like a net full of fish. You have to keep the good fish, but throw the junk back. That evening, when all was done, they were all too tired for the small talk with the people on the beach, so Jesus suggested they head straight out across the lake. The disciples were already in the boat, so they just pulled up the anchor and sailed lazily away on the flat, calm water, with just a slight offshore breeze to give them way. So, do you guys understand the illustrations about the different kinds of soil? Their reply was sufficiently non-committal for Jesus to continue. If you don't get this basic truth, you may well have trouble with all the other parables I tell. See, the seed is the word of God. The footpaths are the places where people regularly walk, and as you know, familiarity always breeds contempt. So what God says just bounces off them and is snatched away by the enemy. The seed on the rocky soil is like those whose response is only shallow, immediate enthusiasm, but no real commitment. Trouble shrivels up the potential growth like the midday sun. The seeds among the weeds are like people whose lives are full of stuff. They just don't have time or energy for anything else. But the good ground is like ploughed up and harrowed topsoil, all broken up and receptive to the seed. And that's where the seed can produce a bumper crop. Broken lives tend to be the most open to what God is saying. They were all quiet after that, and before long the sound of gentle snoring told them that Jesus was enjoying a well-earned rest. In the gathering gloom, they didn't notice the black clouds building up behind them in the west. With no warning, a wall of water hit them, driven by a furious squall. All was bedlam, sails ripping, spars breaking, sailors bailing, landsmen screaming. The boat was swamped and ready to take them all to the bottom of the lake. But Jesus slept on, oblivious. "Hey, teacher!" someone yelled. "Don't you care that we're all about to drown?" Jesus sat up, and he ordered the wind to quiet down and the water to be peaceful, and almost immediately everything changed. The wind died to a whisper, and the waves shrank back to ripples, and there was a silence, only broken by the drips from what remained of the rigging. "So, why were you all so terrified? Don't you trust me?" "Who in the world is this man?" they asked each other quietly as they bailed the water out of the hull. "He speaks to the wind and to the waves, and they obey him." They headed on across the lake in the moonlight towards a stretch of shore that they might have preferred to avoid, especially in the middle of the night. The cliffs were honeycombed with tombs and caves. The stories of walking dead abounded. So when the boat eventually grounded on the beach, they were somewhat reluctant to alight. But Jesus shamed them all by jumping fearlessly over the side and crunching up the gravel. So they followed, bunching together, nervous of being left behind. Their footfalls were muffled when they reached the grass, so the silence of the place closed in on them. "What was that?" someone gasped. There were sounds coming from all around them, grumblings and groanings. With the tail of their eyes, they caught movements among the rocks. Was it their imaginations playing tricks with the moon-etched shadows? Then all doubt was gone. A scream echoed down through the ravines, and they could just make out a creature in the moonlight scurrying along a cliff top above them, silhouetted against the starry sky. It had lank, straggly hair, long claws, and chains dragging behind it, and then it was gone for a moment. But they could still hear it panting as it scampered down over the rocks through the scrub towards where they were standing. Then round a big rock it bounded and came skidding to a halt not 10 paces from where they all stood, tightly bunched behind Jesus. It spoke in a rasping, semi-human voice.
"What are you doing here, Jesus? Son of the Most High God, eh? I hope you're not going to give us trouble."
"Get out of him, you unclean spirit," barked Jesus. It was as though the man had been clubbed by a 2x4. He fell to the floor and began to whimper. "Do you have a name?" asked Jesus. The creature looked up from where it was grovelling, and gathering what shreds of dignity it retained, replied in a voice that sounded like a multitude, echoing from a long way off.
"My name is Legion, since there are thousands of us in this body."
The hair rose on the necks of the disciples, but Jesus stood silently watching. Under his stare the creature seemed to shrink back and cower into the ground. It began to moan.
"No, please, anything but that. Don't send us to the abyss. How about sending us into these pigs, but not the abyss?"
"Pigs? What pigs?" "Go!" Immediately what they'd taken for rocks all around them jumped to their feet and stampeded along the steep bank. Then they turned straight for the lake and hurled themselves into the water. The squealing and thundering of thousands of frenzied trotters was immediately cut off, and there was nothing but the dust in the moonlight to suggest that there had ever been an immense herd of pigs all around them. "Well, don't just stand there gaping," Jesus said to his stunned disciples. "This gentleman needs a bath and a shave. And get those shackles off him. Anyone got any spare clothes? We can't leave him stark naked." By the time the sun was rising, the transformation was complete. Someone had a fire going, and breakfast was served on the beach, with the guest of honor, whose real name they discovered, but later forgot to record, sitting as sane as could be. Further down the beach, a group of disconsolate farmers were wandering among the corpses that had washed up on the beach. They were none too pleased by the looks of them. But then they shouldn't have been rearing pigs in the first place, since Moses had declared their meat non-kosher. When they eventually recognized the liberated man and ascertained who was responsible for their financial ruin, they asked Jesus to leave. So the disciples all climbed back into their boat and made to push off. "Let me come with you," begged the man. "No, I need a representative on this shore. Go on home and tell all your friends what God's done for you." Back in Capernaum, there was great consternation over the fate of the fishermen in the storm the previous night. Their boat was still missing in the morning, so apparently they'd not returned. So when the boat eventually docked around lunchtime, a huge crowd turned out to welcome them safe home. All the little waterfront cafes emptied out as people came down to the beach to see for themselves, the chief attraction being Jesus himself. There were relieved wives and children in the crowd. But not everyone was relieved. There was a very worried-looking gentleman, Jairus, the administrator of the local synagogue. He was anxious to see Jesus, so hurried up to meet him. "My little girl is dying," he gasped, falling to the ground at Jesus' feet. "Please hurry. I fear we may already be too late, but just touch her and she'll be okay. I'm sure of it." "I'm on my way," Jesus reassured him. Now Jairus lived in a nice house on the outskirts of town, so they had a way to go. But progress was painfully slow, since the crowd was so thick. To make matters worse, there was an unexpected delay when a woman waylaid Jesus. Jairus vaguely recognized her as a member of the prenatal classes that his wife had attended 12 years ago, before their little one, as they affectionately called her, had been born. Hadn't she lost her child and so dropped out of the class? Or perhaps she'd terminated her pregnancy. Either way, she'd been something of an outcast since that time, suffering from an incurable hemorrhage that had bankrupted her as she'd spent every penny she had to find a doctor who could cure her. But medical science just wasn't up to the challenge. So now here she was, seeking a miracle cure. The woman had suffered private agonies of shame ever since the loss of her unborn child. She'd heard all about the miracles that Jesus had been doing around town, but could she ever bring herself to come right out and ask him to heal her? What if he asked her what was wrong? What if other people overheard? Or perhaps if I were just to touch him as he passes, she thought to herself. No one needs to know. So as he'd come up the road, she'd got herself into a position where he was bound to pass close to where she was standing. In her extreme weakness, it was all she could do just to remain upright as the crowd sought to jostle her out of the way. But she'd stood her ground, and now here he was. She reached out, and her fingertips just brushed his sleeve as he passed. The change was immediate. She felt life flooding into her veins, and she knew she was healed. But Jesus stopped and looked round. "Who touched me?" he asked. "Hey, there's a whole crowd of people jostling you. Course someone touched you," said one of the disciples. "No, someone touched my sleeve deliberately." There was nowhere to hide, so the lady stepped forward and fell at his feet. As he bent down to hear what she was saying, she blurted out all her pain. Jesus stood up and helped the lady to her feet. Then, holding up her hand, he said in a voice that was loud and clear so that the whole crowd could hear, "My dear daughter, you are a lady of great faith. Go in peace. You are whole." So there she stood, before the community, pronounced clean, a woman of faith. No more shame, no more doctor's bills. Now it was at that exact moment that someone came up to Jairus with the news that he'd been dreading. "Excuse me, sir, little one's dead. No need to trouble the teacher any more." "Jairus," Jesus said, speaking through the man's grief, "don't fear. Trust me." He excused himself from the crowd, and taking along with him just his 3 disciples, he strode off to the fine house where Jairus' family resided. The funeral directors were already there, and the wailing of the professional mourners greeted them as they approached. "What's all this noise about? You're going to wake the sleeping child," said Jesus, annoyed. "Sleeping child?" they mocked. "The kid's dead, you know. You can't wake the dead no matter how much noise you make." Laughter. "Oh, get out of here," said Jesus. After he went into the house, Jesus shut the door on all the hubbub outside, and taking only Jairus and his wife and the 3 disciples, squeezed into the room where the child lay still on the bed. The little 12-year-old was clearly dead. Jaw slack, eyes open and staring, cheeks and lips drained of color. Jesus sat down on the edge of the bed, and very gently taking the limp hand in his, he spoke quietly to the lifeless little face. "Little one, it's time to get up." Immediately the mouth snapped shut. Color flared in the cheeks, and the child first sat up, then jumped out of bed. "When's breakfast, Mama? I'm starving." "Give us something to eat," said Jesus, chuckling.